because the Titanic was never, ever, ever intended to make the crossing intact. It had to go down. It was a ritual. It was a death ship. From the day it was put on the drawing boards, it was designed to be a death ship. Why? What's the purpose? Who would do such a dastardly thing? How could anything so monstrous and so huge occur? And what would be the point? Because America at the time had just had a huge financial crisis in 1911, and government offices had closed. They hadn't been able to pay their bills. They'd been stretched out, war in the Philippines and other things. They weren't getting the job done. 2 years earlier, in 1910, in April, 7 of the richest men in the world, cumulatively altogether, the single richest block of money in the world at the time, got together at a place called Jekyll Island. And they mapped out a plot. They looked at who was in opposition and how they had to go about this, what they needed to eliminate in order to create a new bank of the United States that they could control and get interest from. The end result of that was this event, which had already been planned for prior to that. This was just a interim planning session to make sure they had all the dots and tittles in the right place, leading up to the 1913 vote on Christmas Eve. What a Christmas present, to create the Federal Reserve Board, a private entity, no more federal than Federal Express, which would create and manage America's money supply and charge us interest for managing our money, just paper. They don't provide any gold backing. They don't provide any real management assistance, except that their take. It's their VIG. It's a bunch of mobsters. Bloodline, family, European monsters. Mostly out of the city of London. J.P. Morgan at the time was the head of the Morgan banking interest, largest bank in the U.S. During this crisis in America, he personally guaranteed money to keep the government going and help them through this while we worked out a solution. All it needed was a heading and some heading information. Steered right to the iceberg. If the iceberg hadn't taken it out, the sub there, according to many, was present in the area to give it the coup de grace. But that wasn't necessary. When that ship went out across the ocean with all of those business people and then other blood sacrifices to that altar position to be taken down, this was these wizards' plot, this plan to get control over America. It looked so relatively minor, innocent, a huge tragedy of the day. Nobody understood the leverage it had on the fate of America, even up to this year right now. This ship, the Titanic, the White Star Line, which by the way is code for Sirius, the dog star. The White Star Line is owned by Morgan. And the Titanic, being this ship, was set up as being the very, very finest ship ever to float the oceans, the most magnificent, the unsinkable. And Morgan was scheduled to get on the ship leaving London a couple of days previous and cross the Atlantic with others who were the richest American businessmen of the time. The plan was is that they could talk during this voyage and try to figure out what they could come up with as the solution to eliminate these banking crises that were happening over and over. John Jacob Astor, arguably by many people the richest single man on the planet at the time, an American, who opposed a national bank of a type that eventually became what we call the Federal Reserve. Ivan Strauss, Benjamin Guggenheim, other businessmen cumulatively together representing the largest single block of American businessmen and wealth in the country, and men that were very opposed to this European orchestrated central bank. They were all going to be on the Titanic to talk these things over, try to work through a solution that was acceptable, that then could be pushed politically and brought to pass, so we wouldn't have these monetary crises and government crises, government employees not getting a check and having to go home. That wasn't acceptable. When they got on the ship, J.P. Morgan's bags, his servants, everything had been brought to the boat, loaded on. He was all ready to go. Everybody was anxiously awaiting his arrival. And of course, being a bit of a diva, he was going to arrive, at the last minute because he's such an important person. And then with very short notice and only a few of the people even on the boat realizing it had happened, apparently he had other things that came up and he couldn't leave suddenly for these very important meetings on the boat and had to stay behind.
Literally thousands of seamen were out of a job because of a coal strike. Ships were just laid idle. There was no coal to get them to sea. Thousands of sailors are without work, and yet these men choose to throw themselves out of a job.
And the greasers down below were not the only ones reluctant to board the Titanic on its maiden voyage.
If you look at the records, 55, mainly first-class passengers, have also cancelled their voyage.
The strangest cancellation of all was the ship's owner, the financier J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan. He had promised publicly to go on the maiden voyage, but he cancelled at the last minute on grounds of ill health. And shortly afterwards, the New York Times reporter ran him to earth in the south of France, where he was extremely healthily diverting himself with his mistress.
Were intended to be baited there. It was always intended to be bait onto this gilded cage, to be taken out into the North Atlantic and sunk in a ritual in order to secure their position to get control over America.
So in November of 1910, bankers met at Jekyll Island at a secret meeting in Georgia to discuss the formation of the Federal Reserve. All right, this was dotting the I's, crossing the T's. This was already planned. The plan was already in motion. They had some obstacles, all right? Some of these obstacles included John Jacob Astor, several other wealthy men, dozens of millionaires, not just their money, but their influence, their backing on Wall Street, their influence in Congress, their ability to stop the plan from going forth, the Federal Reserve. These men had to be taken care of. This opposition had to be dealt with in one way or another. Now, this was a hit. All right, this was a hit. The Jesuit order, at the order of the Vatican, with the backing of the Rothschilds. This was a Rothschild hit. Vatican was complicit. The Jesuits did the dirty work. J.P. Morgan fronted the ship. They had this huge death ship. It was a satanic ritual. It was satanic. There's no doubt about that. This was a satanic ritual. All right. And they had it all backed up. They had their asses covered on every angle. They had another ship there, ready to pick up the other people. They were discouraging people from boarding the Titanic because they knew it was going down. The trade union, the word on the street, told the coal shovelers, skip this one. This isn't the ship you want to go on. It was a setup from the beginning. And it's all about this timeline, okay? November 1910, secret meeting at Jekyll Island. June 1911, the intentional compromising of the Olympic, which was the sister ship to the Titanic. Identical in every way, okay? They compromised the hull of the Olympic in order to switch it with the Titanic later so they could sink the Titanic. No one would know the difference. Now, I've seen this. Everyone thinks this is an insurance scam. All right? You've dug about 3 feet deep. If you dig about 3 feet deeper, you'll see this was not an insurance scam. This was setting up the Titanic to get sunk. All right? This is one of the best videos I've ever seen on this subject. This is a rare video. It's an old video. It's hard to find. I can't believe I found it again. And it's not in its original form. Somebody redid the video. Not too poorly. They did a pretty decent job. The core information is there. This expose into the switching of the Titanic with the sister ship, the Olympic, is the key to this. It's the key to this. It demonstrates the plan. Okay, so just look at the order of events. November 1910, they discussed the formation of the Federal Reserve and the secret island meeting of Jekyll Island. June 1911, they compromised the hull of the Olympic, the sister ship for the Titanic, and in April of 1912, they sunk the Titanic. Now, in 1913, they formed the Federal Reserve. So, my claim is validated by the results. Okay, this is what happened. The Federal Reserve got formed. As a result of there being no opposition, Woodrow Wilson was complicit as well, other factors. This was a setup. It was a plan in motion, and this is how it went down.
Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, how the largest moving object ever fashioned by the hand of man hit an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank in the middle of the North Atlantic. 1,500 lives were lost. The tragedy has been well documented in books and on film. No matter how often the story is told, it never fails to capture our imagination. Yet, it is a story that has left many questions unanswered. Now, for the first time, we take a fresh look at some of the mysteries surrounding the Titanic and reveal evidence that leads to a compelling and shocking hypothesis: that the ship that plummeted 2 miles to the bottom of the sea was not the Titanic, but its sister ship, the Olympic. Over dinner at Pirrie's London residence in 1907, Lord Pirrie and White Star Line's Bruce Ismay conceived the idea of building 3 luxurious superliners. First the Olympic, then the Titanic, and finally the Britannic. That first week in March 1912 was the last time that the Olympic and Titanic were together in Belfast. The twin ships side by side on the River Lagan. And that was when the decision to switch them could have been made.
You can't be serious. No one will know we've switched them when they get back to work on Monday morning. They'll just swap the names. Everything else is standard White Star issue. I have some boys at the yard who'll do the job for a couple of £100 each. Say nothing. We'll never get away with it. If word of this gets out, it's either that, Ismay, or we both go down. White Star Line and this yard. There's got to be another way.
There isn't. We have no choice.
Right. That's it then.
There's a wee scam going on here, and the bosses are in on it. They switched those ships 2 weeks ago, and I know it.
Listen to me, Paddy. Any more talk from you about 2 ships being swapped over, and you'll end up at the bottom of the River Lagan. So remember that when you get back to your wife and your 17 kids, you Irish scum.
And I'll be there, of course. Along for the ride.
All right, then I want to choose my own officers.
Yes. Of course, E.J. Men you can trust, eh?
Shortly before Titanic sailed, Chief Officer Wilde, who was to lose his life 3 nights later, wrote a letter to his sister in which he said, "I still don't like this ship." Strange thing for a man to say, who had just set foot on board the day before. Unless, of course, he realized he was actually on his old ship Olympic. By the way, when I refer to the Titanic from this time on, I want you to remember that I'm actually talking about the ship that started out its life as the Olympic, but which we believe by this stage had been switched and taken on the identity of the Titanic. The coal strike is important for another, possibly more sinister reason. Most other ships were desperate for coal, and passengers and cargo destined for the New World were stuck in Europe. Yet, the Leyland liner Californian, under the command of Captain Stanley Lord, left the port of London on the 5th of April, 1912, just 5 days before Titanic's departure from Southampton, not only fully coaled, but apart from her own crew, empty of passengers. With more than enough coal to get her to the United States, she headed off into the middle of the Atlantic at full speed, empty. Apart from a cargo of woolen sweaters. Florence Ismay, wife of J. Bruce Ismay, also turned down the opportunity of taking the maiden voyage on the world's most luxurious liner, preferring instead to take their children on a motoring holiday, after first claiming ill health. He ordered the ship turned to port and, inexplicably, engines full astern. By reversing the engines, Murdoch was actually increasing the risk of collision, something he must have known. Maybe Murdoch, hand-picked by Captain Smith, was deciding to give the iceberg a nudge anyway. Second Officer Lightoller told the inquiry that before going off duty for the night, he would have been easily able to see an iceberg from 1.5 miles, more probably 2 miles away. He also said that the iceberg would have been just as visible from the bridge as from the crow's nest. Plenty of time to turn and avoid it then. In an emergency such as this, it was never a good idea to turn your broadside to danger. Even if Titanic had rammed the iceberg head-on, it would have stayed afloat. Although up to 250 crewmen would have been killed while they slept in their bunks in the bow. It was 35 minutes before the first distress signal was sent. 35 minutes before the first radio emergency, CQD, was sent. 45 minutes before starting the pumps. 45 minutes before starting to prepare the lifeboats.
If there's any talk of the ship being swapped in Belfast, or any stories of insurance fraud going on, then there will be 20 years of His Majesty's pleasure awaiting you and no job to come out to when it's over. So, think on this when you see your wives and sweethearts.
You'll never believe what they've just done.
How many?
I'm told 1,500. The position is simply this, Prime Minister. The White Star Line is on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, if White Star were forced to go into liquidation, La Holland and Wolf Yard in Belfast would also be placed in a very precarious position, perhaps even forced to close down. Now, that means that 20,000 men will be laid off, not to mention the effect on all the subsidiary and dependent industries. Quite frankly, it is a political situation we cannot afford, Prime Minister. Alienate the Irish, and we will most certainly lose seats in Belfast. The Fenians, the Republicans, will seize the opportunity. And with our majority gone, we will undoubtedly lose the next election, Prime Minister.
There is the chance of a blunder here of unprecedented proportions.
We are going to have to go along with this, Prime Minister.
I will not see a stain put upon the British government. Not for the White Star Line, not for Holland and Wolf, not for the Irish, and certainly not for the interests of J.P. Morgan.
I would also remind you, Prime Minister, that as part of the arrangement for an American company to acquire the White Star Line, J.P. Morgan agreed that this government could requisition his ships as Royal Naval Reserves should the need arise. I would also remind you, Prime Minister, that the situation in Europe is becoming ever more doubtful. If the White Star Line were to go into liquidation, the major creditor would be J.P. Morgan himself. Now, as both owner and banker, he would certainly exercise his rights to seize his assets. And we would lose all those ships, Prime Minister.
It's a sad day for England, when the policies of a British government are dictated by greedy and ruthless businessmen. And if it ever became public, doubtless you have someone in mind to run the show?
Yes. I thought we could bring Mersey out of retirement. He's reliable, he knows how the system works, he's discreet, and he will do what needs to be done.
My son is called to the bar. I would be more comfortable if he were there to keep an eye on things.
Of course, Prime Minister. We'll find employment for him in the Attorney General's office.
Very well, then. But neither I nor the administration know anything about it.
Prime Minister.
So the hull of the Olympic was intentionally compromised so that they could switch it with the Titanic, and when they intentionally sunk the Titanic, it'd be an easy drop. It'd go down. A little explosion in the starboard prow, a little fire that'd been burning before they actually set out. Fires that's well documented, that's been compromising the hull. Pictures of it charred on the front. They planned all this. I refer you back to the timeline. Jekyll Island, November 1910. They planned all of this. Then in June of 1911, they executed the first phase, which was the compromising of the Olympic. Then in April of 1912, they intentionally sunk the Titanic with various means. Very suspicious pilot maneuvering with the reversing of engines and the sharp turning to port when approaching an obstacle. It's so against the manuals, but the iceberg was a distraction for the explosion. And the explosion and everyone who witnessed it got shut off and drowned. Shut off in their little compartments and basically eliminated. All the witnesses were eliminated. They had specially picked crew members on board with guns to actually shoot people. There were reports of them shooting people, not just like in the movie where they were shooting them from overwhelming the lifeboats. No, they were eliminating people with guns, trapping them in compartments and flooding the compartments. They exploded the ship. It was exploded in the part where it was compromised. It was all specifically in the same spots. I mean, look, this is indicative of a conspiracy. That's what happened here. They planned it in 1910. They executed the first phase in 1911. They sunk the Titanic in 1912, and in 1913 they formed the Federal Reserve.
What does it take for an event to remain culturally relevant and commonly discussed decades after the event has happened? What would cause such a stir that the whole world would know what happened and still be talking about it a century later? Luckily, to find out, you only need to look at one of the few situations that fall into this category. Which incident? The sinking of the RMS Titanic. Almost everyone knows the story of the unsinkable ship that met its tragic fate in the Atlantic off the coast of Canada. Even if they can't remember all the details, they know of the ship, the iceberg, and the catastrophe that followed. But what if the public hasn't heard the whole story? What happened that night has been played out and examined by experts since April 15, 1912. Every note taken and move made by crew members analyzed and scrutinized to help solve the mystery of that tragic night. How could such an event take place? What would cause such a tragedy to occur? What if there was more to the story than an iceberg and a faulty assumption that the ship was unsinkable? What if the accident was orchestrated to remove the powerful and wealthy rivals of J.P. Morgan, one of the men that owned the Titanic. If this were true, what could possibly be worth the lives of more than 1,500 people? Why would he do such a thing? Is there evidence that points to such a plot? It is important to understand everything that was happening behind the scenes and all the facts before deciding whether or not this could be true. The level of influence and wealth involved is staggering, and the more questions you ask, the stranger the facts become. So, is there more to the story about the sinking of the Titanic? Who are the players, and what are the facts? J.P. Morgan, one of the most ruthless financiers of the age, was a strong proponent of the development of an organization that had yet to be built, the Federal Reserve. He believed that the Federal Reserve was not only a good idea, but a necessary one. He and his bank had to personally organize and oversee the bailouts of many smaller banks and businesses, using his leverage and clout to convince others to go along with his plans. He believed that a central bank system would ease the stress of the large banks that were at the mercy of bank runs caused by smaller banks and market forces. J.P. Morgan wanted a private version of the Federal Reserve as opposed to a government-controlled Federal Reserve, which was being proposed at the time by progressives in Washington. Only professionals and expert bankers should be in charge of the central bank, not government bureaucrats, thought Morgan. He was in favor of and a vocal proponent for the private Federal Reserve option. Other wealthy and influential members of society were opposed to the development of the Federal Reserve in opposition to J.P. Morgan. 3 of these people were Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. Isidor Straus was co-owner of Macy's department store with his brother Nathan. Benjamin Guggenheim was a wealthy Jewish-American businessman. Jacob Astor IV was the 4th generation of wealthy Astors who dealt in real estate, among other business concerns spanning the United States. Jacob Astor was the wealthiest person on the Titanic when it sunk and was, in relation to GDP, one of the richest men to ever live. These men, and many others, were opposed to the development of the Federal Reserve Bank, thinking that the system would give the bankers too much power. The bankers, including J.P. Morgan and the Rockefeller family, already had far too much power in their opinion, and they did not want to give them any more leverage. The Federal Reserve would do just that, and they were in vocal opposition to the idea. Having wealthy business rivals and strong personalities with differing viewpoints isn't uncommon in the world of high finance. However, the fact that these disagreements exist isn't enough to imply that the crashing and sinking of the Titanic was planned and coordinated by J.P. Morgan. Interestingly, when you dig deeper, you find a string of coincidences, incredible luck, and stories that don't quite line up, particularly when it comes to J.P. Morgan himself. What kind of coincidences and luck, you may ask? Well, while J.P. Morgan was scheduled to be on the Titanic for her maiden voyage, he abruptly canceled his trip at the last minute. Why was he not taking this momentous and grand voyage? He was supposedly ill. While the reason for the cancellation of his trip was an illness, J.P. Morgan was reported to be seen mere days later with his mistress, shopping in Europe for luxury goods. By all reports, he seemed in good health and as his usual self while out shopping. As you can imagine, with all the pomp and the fanfare with the Titanic, it would have been a great opportunity to get his face out there and promote his ideas and plans. The grand voyage of the Titanic was the biggest social event of the upper class and was a chance no one would miss for the world. Would a businessman of the caliber of J.P. Morgan avoid such a potentially beneficial opportunity because he was feeling ill? As an avid art collector and connoisseur, J.P. Morgan treasured and valued beautiful art pieces. Just hours before the departure of the Titanic, it is reported that he removed multiple bronze statues that belonged to him from the Titanic. It seems an odd thing to do since the Titanic's destination was New York, where Morgan lived at the time. Couldn't the statues be delivered once they arrived? It would certainly be the cheaper and more practical thing to do. Regardless, the statues and valued art pieces were removed from the ship hours before her scheduled departure. Did J.P. Morgan know something the others didn't? J.P. Morgan's dear friend, Milton Hershey, also canceled his booking on the Titanic. He instead returned to New York on the America on April 7th. Milton Hershey went on to build the Hershey's chocolate empire that is known worldwide today. But if all of this implies that J.P. Morgan somehow knew about Titanic's fate, where did he get this information? Well, White Star Line is the name of the company that built and operated the Titanic. This company was owned by a trust company called International Mercantile and Marine Company, better known as IMM. This trust was organized and financed by J.P. Morgan himself. The entire project was put together as a way to better control the shipping industry and its competitors. By being the financier and the organizer of this trust, J.P. Morgan was in effect owning not only IMM but also White Star Lines, which owned the Titanic. So indirectly, J.P. Morgan actually owned the Titanic. The Titanic was a massive vessel. Enormous, in fact. It was one of the biggest ships ever built at the time. An astounding 882 feet long and 92 feet wide at its widest point. So you can imagine that a ship of this size and complexity would need a thorough inspection to make sure she was in good shape for her maiden voyage. An inspection on this vessel would typically take 2 to 3 days. This would allow enough time to inspect all of the necessary components and systems. Considering that the wealthiest and most influential people on the planet would be on that ship, the inspections should be even more thorough and take more time. However, what is strange was that on the day of Titanic's inspection in Belfast, Ireland, it only took a few hours to inspect the entire ship. It is reported that the inspectors didn't even go to see the engine before giving the Titanic an official, final thumbs up. Any ship that sails the seas needs insurance, especially when you consider the cost of building a gigantic vessel like the Titanic. The owners would like their investment protected. Interestingly, when it comes to the Titanic, it seems that the insurance was increased only 15 days before the departure for New York. In today's dollar, the Titanic cost $200 million to build. That is a hefty price tag. The insurance was increased to include the total loss of the vessel, and the owners were insured for the price of $5 million. Not only were they insured for the total loss of the vessel at full price, but the owners also received their check for the $5 million a mere 30 days after the Titanic had sunk. As for the survivors, they sued the White Star Line. This settlement took 4 years to be resolved in court. The final settlement was for $665,000. That is roughly $430 for every life lost. Lifeboats are the final defense against the unlikely event that a ship the size of the Titanic sinks. By law, it is required that vessels the size of the Titanic have lifeboat capacity for 1,060 passengers, and while the Titanic was meant to have 32 lifeboats, it only had 20, because they felt the deck would be too cluttered by more lifeboats. With a maximum capacity of 3,547 passengers, the Titanic would have needed more than double the number of lifeboats that it had on deck the night it sank to the bottom of the Atlantic. With only 2,208 passengers, it was over 1,000 people shy of its maximum capacity. Also, the crewmen were not well trained in the use of the lifeboats or the mechanisms that lowered them into the water. On top of that, many of these boats left only partially full, leaving many others to die on the Titanic. Was the lack of lifeboats a mistake or a conscious decision? Is it a coincidence that the crewmen weren't trained on the use of the mechanisms meant to be used in an emergency? How is it possible that an unsinkable ship be sunk on its maiden voyage? How is it that the engineer who deemed the ship unsinkable, who was on the ship, even after hearing about the damage, assumed that the ship would be fine? Maybe because he knew that a mere iceberg collision isn't enough to sink the ship he engineered. Could it be that something else made the ship more vulnerable than they had initially expected it to be? If such a thing were true and the ship wasn't in proper order, the logical thing to conclude is that it would be reported to the appropriate authorities and dealt with before departure. Now, while this seems like the normal course of action, this is not what took place on the RMS Titanic. What could weaken such a large vessel, making it more vulnerable to danger from external forces, such as an iceberg? Fire. In the coal cellars of the ship, it was reported that an out-of-control coal fire had been raging for days. Smoldering coal fires weren't particularly rare in large steamliners, but this fire was apparently enough to cause many of the engine workers to quit. More than half of those that worked in the coal cellars quit before the Titanic left the harbor. This happened in the middle of a coal shortage, and there was not much work to be had for the men that quit. These men knew this and still chose to quit rather than sail on the Titanic. What did they know that the other passengers didn't? The question then becomes, if there is a fire in the coal, how do you solve that problem? The typical solution was to load as much coal into the engine as possible to burn away the excess material before it could light on fire. Could this explain the speed at which the Titanic was speeding through the night in iceberg-infested waters? It is well known that the side that was struck by the iceberg was on the same side as the coal cellars. Could it be that a raging fire weakened the hull, allowing the iceberg to tear through the ship? Or perhaps the water that went into the fire caused an explosion? If there was such a disastrous fire burning, why weren't the passengers notified and the trip canceled? Captain Edward Smith was one of the most decorated and experienced captains that worked for the White Star Line. He had commanded vessels for over a decade. He had successfully moved from ship to ship, growing in ship size and responsibility in his roles, until he was the commander of the largest and most prestigious vessels at White Star Line. Many passengers would only go on ships that he was commanding. He was well known for inspecting the ship daily, and was widely respected and even admired for how he managed his vessels and crew. It seems odd then that so many things could go wrong on his watch. An admired, seasoned sea veteran had so many missteps in one evening. How many missteps? Well, he ignored 6 iceberg warnings from multiple different ships that had crossed in the waters they were heading into. He allowed the ship to cruise at almost full speed, 22.5 knots. Her max was 24 knots. To be cruising at full speed in ice-infested waters seems foolhardy, to say the least. As captain, He would have known about the fire in the coal cellar, yet didn't say a thing about it to the passengers. His crewmen weren't trained to properly shoot off distress flares in the case of an emergency. While there were flares that were shot off, they weren't meant to be shot in 1-minute intervals, indicating to any ships in the area that they were in distress. Instead, they shot off 8 in 1 hour, approximately 6 to 7 minutes apart. This conveyed nothing meaningful to any ship in the area, some of which continued on to their destinations even after seeing the flares being shot. How could the captain allow such a thing? There are many differing accounts of the captain's behavior that night as the evacuation was happening. It is reported that he was ineffective and did not give clear orders to his men. Other reports say that he was decisive and helped direct the rescue efforts. Unfortunately, the captain lost his life when the Titanic sunk that evening. Perhaps the most mysterious part of the entire event is that it was almost predicted in great detail 14 years earlier in a book called The Wreck of the Titan. The similarities are uncanny. The Titan was described as the largest vessel afloat at the time. So was the Titanic. Both the Titan and the Titanic were considered to be unsinkable ships. The Titan was 800 feet long, and the Titanic was 880 feet long. The Titan was sunk by striking an iceberg going near full speed, 25 knots. The Titanic sank after striking an iceberg at near full speed, 22.5 knots. The Titan sank 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The Titanic sunk 400 miles off the coasts of Newfoundland, Canada. The Titan sunk in April. The Titanic sunk in April. The Titan was extremely low on lifeboats, 24, leading to the unnecessary deaths of many of the passengers. The Titanic was extremely low on lifeboats, 20, which led to the unnecessary deaths of many of the passengers. While this does not necessarily implicate J.P. Morgan and the creation of the Federal Reserve, it does seem like an incredibly unlikely coincidence, another one that is related to the sinking of the Titanic. Fast forward 1 year, the year after the sinking of the Titanic, the Federal Reserve was created. With much squabbling in Washington about the details of the Federal Reserve Act, it passed, and the Federal Reserve was born. J.P. Morgan's vision of a Federal Reserve Bank controlled by bankers was not exactly as he would have wanted it. There was some federal government control wielded by the appointees to the Federal Reserve Board, but their control of the actual operation is limited. Some elected representatives were critics of the act and stated as much after it had been passed by Congress. President Woodrow Wilson himself, who helped form the bill and used much of his political capital to get it passed, eventually came to regret signing it. He said this near the end of his life. "I'm a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." It would seem J.P. Morgan got his way after all. The Federal Reserve was created with minimal oversight from the federal government. He would never live to see the Federal Reserve in action, as he passed away in 1913, the same year the bill had passed. The question remains, did he have a direct hand in making sure that the opposition to this massive change in the U.S. financial policy was silenced? Would he go to such lengths to ensure the completion of this institution? Was it a string of coincidences and bad luck that led to one of the worst maritime disasters in history? Or were there more sinister motives at work? The truth to these questions may never be fully clear. The only certainty is this: deep at the bottom of the ocean lies the wreck of one of the most magnificent ships ever to be built. An unsinkable ship that met its fate one frigid April evening, taking with it 1,500 souls and a mystery that can never be solved.